Now that we've got the philosophies that lead into World War II, I want to give you a class over the war itself. And what I'm going to concentrate on is just the question why one side won and one side lost. In this, I'm not really going to give you much of a military history of the war. That's something that just takes too involved and is too complicated. But we're going to go into uh, what were the strengths and weaknesses of each side, and really why it should have been obvious from the get-go who was winning and who was losing. And we'll build up on that over the course of this class. But let's start off just by going over what the two sides are. World War II was fought between two coalitions. One is generally the popular history called the Axis. Those are the countries of Japan, Italy, and Germany. And really, of those three, only two of them really counted, Japan and Germany. Italy was just kind of there. They called them the Axis, just a trivia question, because in the 1938, these three countries signed a treaty called the Anti-Comintern Pact. The Comintern was short for the Communist International. That was an international movement centered out of the Soviet Union to try to spread communism. These three countries said they were going to oppose that. And in the treaty, they described themselves as the new axis around which the world will revolve, saying that power will go from the victorious side that came out of World War I, which was the United States, Britain, and France, and go to them. Fighting against them was pretty much everyone else in the rest of the world, with the big nations being the Soviet Union, the UK, and the United States, with France just kind of there. Well, France was there for a while, then they lost. So in this war, the war was started by the Axis powers. The Axis powers were fascist nations. That is, you can see variations of fascism in each of those nations. And that's one of the reasons why I gave you the class over the big political ideologies first, because we concluded with that fascists are about war. That is, that's the whole purpose of having a fascist government is to take a country to war. War for them is seen as a positive good. And so the fascist nations are going to start the war. And they're going to have several advantages from that fact that they started the war. Start off with is just the first mover advantage. If your side moves first in any game, you have an edge in the final outcome. But anyway, before we get into that, let's get into a little bit of a background about the war. I don't really like to go into um, the military history of the war because it's just too complicated. Really, there was no such thing as World War II to a certain extent. What you actually had were four simultaneous wars that were going on that involved the same coalitions of nations, more or less, but that happened more or less independently of each other. The first of these was a war in East Asia that started in 1931 when Japan took over the Chinese province of Manchuria. In 1937, they expanded this into a broad based invasion of China. And that war would go on right up until the end in August of 1945. And this is a conflict that most people really know nothing about. The newspapers during the war outside of China didn't really cover it very much. And the history books cover it even less, which is kind of unfortunate because, for one thing, it was a bloodbath. China had the second highest number of casualties in the war, behind only the Soviet Union. And also because if you were a veteran of Iraq or Afghanistan, or you know anybody who has, you have seen the legacy of this Chinese-Japanese war, because the Japanese went into China with the technologically advanced and better organized military. The Chinese military couldn't really oppose it. So whenever they fought, the Japanese generally won. But China, as you can see here, is huge, right? And as the Japanese went into China, they could take any particular piece of land that they wanted to, but they couldn't control the country. The Chinese wound up fighting a guerrilla war, particularly the Chinese communists. They set up a set of strategies for how you fight against a superior enemy, a technologically superior enemy, one with better firepower, taking advantage of the huge size of the country and their superior appeal to common people. And the strategies that they laid out, especially the Chinese communists, were going to be used worldwide after the Second World War. If you fought the Taliban used basically the same strategies that the Chinese communists developed fighting the Japanese. If you know anybody fought in Vietnam, the Vietnamese communists used the same strategies. If you know anybody who was in Iraq, the Iraqi rebels, to a lesser extent, were using the same strategies. So this is an interesting conflict, but it was only one of four that was going on simultaneously. The second one chronologically that broke out was the war in Western Europe. This one in 1939 looked like a rerun of the Western Front in the First World War. It was fought by the same nations, Germany on one side, the UK and France on the other. This war started technically when Germany invaded Poland. Poland is in Eastern Europe, but it was allied to both France and Britain. However, once Germany invaded Poland, England and France declared war on Germany and then didn't do anything for 6 months. They were very passive because they thought this was going to be a rerun of the First World War. That is, Germany would attack, the war would bog down into a stalemate, and they would run a blockade that would cut Germany off from supplies. Eventually, they would starve Germany out. Germany would run out of supplies, they'd run out of food, and they'd wind up surrendering like they did in World War I. That was the plan, and that was a reasonable assumption of what would happen. However, it didn't work out that way. The Germans fought the war differently. We'll go over that in a minute. And this time they won in the West pretty quickly. They knocked out France. However, they could never get to Britain. And eventually the United States, like in World War I, would get involved too. So the war in the West was a war of Germany against first France and the UK, then UK and US. They would march west in 1940, and the Americans and the British would march east in 1944-45. Right? The third major war that was going on simultaneously was the war in the Soviet Union. This one started to the shock of the world when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. We'll get more into that in a little bit. This was the most horrific and brutal of the four fronts. That is, in this conflict, you saw the Germans basically fighting a war of extermination. No nation suffered more from World War II than the Soviet Union did. They launched a genocidal war, not just against the Soviets, including against Poland. One out of every six Polish people died during the course of World War II. If you're familiar with the Holocaust, this was ground zero of the Holocaust. This was where all the concentration camps were, and where most of the people who got sent to the camps came from. Right? The fourth conflict was the war in the Pacific, which started on December 7th, 1941, when, to the shock of the world, a Japanese fleet attacked the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. And this war would go on until it ended with a bang in August of 1945. So you see four loosely connected conflicts going on together. And as I stated previously, the Axis powers, Germany and Japan, are going to have an initial advantage because they're going to start these conflicts. They're going to get the first shot. They're going to dictate how the war is going to go. Also, since they are going to be starting the war, they're going to have more time to get prepared. So they go into the war with militaries ready for war. And they go in with military traditions. Both Germany and Japan had a long history of fighting wars. That is, they had societies where the military was an elite function. So they had professional officer corps, they had professional non-commissioner officers, they had a high level of military tradition, and they had armies that were ready to go. And that can give them, in a lot of ways, significant advantages. For example, the person you're looking at here is a Japanese admiral, Isoroku Yamamoto. He was the commander of the Japanese fleet in 1941. Both the Japanese and the Americans expected the war to go the same. That is, they figured a war between the United States and Japan would fight their way across the Pacific until a final battle was fought somewhere around here, right, in the waters off of Japan. Both sides figured that the final battle would be fought primarily with battleships. Right? So Japanese strategy was to use everything else, small boats like destroyers, submarines, and airplanes, to weaken the American battleship fleet on its way to Japan. They were hoping that they could knock out maybe 20% of the American battleships before the Americans get here for the final struggle. As part of that plan, Isoroku Yamamoto came up with a very bold idea. Japan by 1941 had six aircraft carriers. He decided to take most of Japan's aircraft that was associated with the Navy, put them on those six battleships, take them across 5,000 miles of open ocean, and attack the American battleships while they were still in harbor in Honolulu at the U.S. Navy base at Pearl Harbor. Right? Nothing like this on this scale had ever been done before. The British had done something on a smaller scale the year earlier when they attacked the Italian fleet at harbor in a place called Taranto. But they attacked Taranto with only about 35 planes. Yamamoto is planning on bringing in 6 aircraft carriers worth. And this is a bold plan, needs a bold leader, needs an officer corps that can pull it off. And the Japanese did. They achieved what they set out to achieve. They hit 9 American aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor. They knocked all 9 of them out of commission. Some of them would wind up returning back to duty, but that's going to take a couple of years. Right? So if you've got a skilled officer like Yamamoto, you could come up with that kind of a plan. If you have skilled officers at lower levels, you can execute that kind of a plan. The Germans had something pretty similar. That is, they had a tradition of people going into the military and seeing the military as a career. Right? They kept this even though the treaties that ended World War I disbanded most of their military. They got rid of the enlisted men, but kept most of the officer corps. And this would give a huge advantage in their initial struggle in World War II. The initial idea that the Germans had on the Western Front was they, like the British and the French, thought that this was going to be a rerun of World War I. They thought they'd invade Belgium, they would go into France. And everybody expected that this would wind up like World War I, where you'd have a stalemate that would go on for 5 or 6 years. However, this guy over here, the one on the right, had a different idea. His name was Heinz Guderian. In the German army in the 30s, Guderian was considered kind of a troublemaker. That is, he was a younger guy with a lot of new ideas. And he came up with a different plan to fight in 1940. His plan was going to center around the tank. Right? His idea was that he would take the 7 divisions worth of tanks that the Germans had, and instead of sending them with the main army as it marched through Belgium, he was going to put them separately and was going to attack this area over here. This is the Ardennes Forest. The French believed that the Ardennes Forest was impassable, meaning that no army could go through it. Guderian, however, saw that there were roads going through there, so he thought the German tanks could make it through. If they came through on the other side, they wouldn't run into any opposition because the French weren't going to bother to defend over here since they thought nothing could move through the forest. Once the German tanks got to over here through the forest, they could then swing in through this direction and cut off most of the French and German armies that would have gone into Belgium waiting an attack like World War I. Also, once they have cut off those armies, they could then turn off in this direction, terrorize French civilians, disrupt the French command structure, and leave any French soldiers over here isolated. You do that, then French resistance will fall apart. None of his superiors wanted to hear what he had to say, except for one. And he was lucky enough that that was his immediate superior, a general named Erich von Mannheim. Mannheim liked the idea, but since Guderian had a bad reputation with the leadership, he said that it was his idea. Right? Hitler got a hold of it, and in February of 1940, Hitler gave him the go-ahead. So they launched their attack through the Ardennes to the shock of the world, and it worked to a T. And in that, by the way, although the plan was pretty bold, it was a good idea, it was a very risky idea. There were only four roads that went through this forest. So the Germans divided up their tanks into four columns. These four columns went 250 miles long. Basically, it was like going bumper to bumper from Houston to Dallas. If one of those German tanks threw an axle, if one French soldier figured out what was going on and fired a gun into one of the tanker trucks carrying gasoline for them, then the entire offensive would have failed. This offensive depended on everything going right. Everything did go right, so to the shock of the world, the Germans had knocked out France very early. You didn't see a repeat of World War I. If you've got good officers, if you've got bold guys like Guderian and Manstein, if you've got people technically competent who can run those tanks, if you have a tradition of discipline that could keep that kind of an attack organized, you have a tremendous advantage. Japan and Germany also had the advantage of superior technology. That is, they had put a great deal of investment into the military during the 1930s. So, in a lot of ways, they had superior technology to their enemies. For example, what you're looking at here is the German Stuka dive bomber. This was the best tactical support aircraft in the world in 1940. That is, they flew these airplanes over troops in the field. And they essentially provided the artillery for infantrymen who were walking along. That is, these dive bombers would see enemy positions and dive bomb them, dive straight at them, drop their bombs. They also had on them sirens. So when they dove, they would turn on the sirens. It would make a terrifying noise. So they were also a psychological weapon. Right? The Allies had nothing to match this in 1940. Also, the Japanese in the Pacific had the best fighter plane, the Japanese Zero. The Americans would not have anything that could match its performance until 1942-43. Right? The Germans arguably had the best tanks in the early part of the war, the German Tiger tank. So if you look at a lot of things, the Axis powers had a lot of advantages when the war started. And they got their ass beat. Because on the other side, you had even more important advantages. And these even more important advantages would keep gathering steam as the war went on and become more and more important. Right? And let's start by looking at the money. Because as the great historian John Shaft once said, even when it's not about the money, it's about the money. You know, they say that Shaft was a bad mother. This is true. The chart you're looking at is comparing the gross domestic product of the Allied nations versus the Axis nations. This is a measure of the economy. We talked about this before. Even at the height of Axis victories, when Germany crushed France, conquered the very highly developed areas of the Netherlands and Belgium to go along with them, and converted them into war production for the Axis side, the Allied power still had a 3-2 productive advantage. Right? America had by itself half of the world's factories. So what can you do in a war if you have a bigger economy? You can produce a hell of a lot of weapons. So as the war went on, American, British, Soviet factories got cranked up and they started to churn out weapon after weapon after weapon. Right? By the time you get to the end of the war, okay, the Allied powers could hit the Axis with the mattress Mac theory. That is, they could hit them with volume, volume, volume. They had more men because the population of their nations were bigger, and they had much more weapons, much better supplies. Right? In addition to all this productive capacity, the Allied powers also had a labor advantage. They had more people to work. Partially, this is because they had bigger populations, but also because they had more people they could tap into. For example, in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, they were very aggressive in bringing women into the workforce. By the time you get to 1945, 20% of all industrial workers in the United States were women. You had higher percentages in Britain and in the Soviet Union. Germany, on the other hand, was very reluctant to use women in their factories, even though they had a tradition of using women workers. They did not want to tap into the giant pool of middle-class married women and bring them into the factories. Right? And let's go into why, because it tells you a lot about Okay, kind of governments that are counterintuitive, and you probably wouldn't think that this was true. Right? And that is that a democracy is a lot better able to call for sacrifices than a dictatorship. And so if you're going to have to bring people to do things they don't want during a war, a democracy is going to be a lot better able to do it. And let's go into why. It has to do with a principle I'd call social ductility. Okay? I learned about ductility when I was an undergraduate. I was a mechanical engineer in undergraduate school. And so in my classes, they taught us about materials. Uh, Materials have, you talk about materials and you talk about strength, it doesn't work the way that you would think. That is, if you take a column of steel and a column of glass and put them side to side, and you put a weight on top of each, which one do you think could hold more weight? The column of steel or the column of glass? It's the column of glass. Glass is much stronger than steel is. So if glass is stronger than steel, then why do they make all the buildings out of steel? Why don't they make tanks out of glass? The answer is although glass is strong, glass is also brittle, right? Meaning that when it fails catastrophically without warning. Steel, on the other hand, is ductile. Right? What ductility means is when you apply force to something, a material that is ductile, it will deform. That is, you can see it bend. And it will deform before it fails. Right? Why is that an edge? Well, say you're in a steel building, it starts to go bad. You could see the deformity before the thing collapses. That means you can have time to go into that building and try to save it, to reinforce it, to try to keep it from collapsing. And even if that doesn't work, since it is deforming, you know what's going bad, you have time to evacuate. So if it collapses, the collapse won't be that bad. On the other hand, if you have glass doesn't deform at all. You can apply force after force after force to it, and you will never notice it until you go one step too far, and then the entire glass structure will disintegrate into a million pieces. Its end will be catastrophic. The reason I'm mentioning that is ductility applies to governments too. Right? If you are in a fascist dictatorship, your leader, somebody like a Hitler, says that he has the ability to give orders and you should follow them. And normally that is true. Hitler can snap his fingers and get things done. But Hitler would also know that his society was very brittle, that he could give orders and expect people to carry him out by fear. But if he goes one step too far, then the entire structure could collapse around him. That is, if people get enraged, if they act on the basis of emotion, if they don't think straight, then maybe they get out in the streets and start rioting against the government. If those riots are bad enough, then the entire government will fall apart. You've seen that happen many times in history. So that means that if you're a fascist dictator like Hitler, you're going to have an innate amount of caution. If you think that something like making married women work in factories might be controversial, if it might enrage your population, then you're going to be pretty reluctant to do it. If you're Franklin Roosevelt, though, you know that your society is more ductile. So if you bring in married women and try to get them to work in your war factories, if it goes bad, then you can always turn the decision around. You're not worrying about your entire governmental structure falling apart, right? About a revolution. So a democracy is a lot more flexible in calling on sacrifices. The communist dictatorship in 1940 turned out to be the same way, right? So they could bring in people like women to work. Also, the United States had another advantage, and that was it borders Mexico. Mexico was not actively involved in the Second World War, but Mexico had a lot of people who could work. And so the United States created something called the Bracero program. That is, they sent, especially the agriculture sector, sent representatives to Mexico, right, and found people and offered them jobs to come into America and work in the American agriculture sector. That way, the United States could draft people who worked on the farm, send them into the army, and these braceros could come in and replace them. Okay? And this actually is going to have a long-term historic importance for the United States because not only did it help them in the war, those braceros, once they learned that there were jobs in America and they learned who to go to in order to get those jobs in America, kept on coming. That is, you did not have restrictions on immigration to the United States from Mexico as of 1940. You wouldn't have until 1965. So once those braceros came over the first time during World War II, they came over subsequent years and worked for more money in America. Once the United States starts creating immigration restrictions, they keep on coming anyway. If you look at today's migrant workers, whether legal or otherwise, they are the grandchildren of the original braceros. Once those contacts get made, you can't unmake them. So the United States, Britain, Soviet Union are going to have enough labor in order to take advantage of their factories. The Japanese and the Germans are going to be a lot more limited. That is, they have smaller populations. They're sending tremendous amount of people to go fight. So they have to figure out ways to replace them. How they replaced them was by using forced laborers. Japan went into China and got Chinese people to do the work for them. Or they went into Korea, other places they occupied. The Germans got laborers from Eastern Europe and from Western Europe, places they conquered, and forced them to come to Germany to work. Right? If they were from Eastern Europe, they were treated with extreme brutality. Right? That is, a lot of the concentration camps were also labor camps. They would take people the week they would kill off immediately. Those that were able to work, they would keep working until they couldn't work anymore, then they would kill them too. The Western Europeans, Nazi racial theory thought of as better, but they kept on exploiting them anyway. That is, they had labor drafts in places like Holland. In France, the Germans never sent the French POWs home after they captured them. The reason why was if, according to international law, if you're keeping a POW, you can make them work. So the Nazi war plants were full of forced laborers. By the time you get to 1945, we estimate there were about 11 million of them. A forced labor doesn't really have much of an incentive to work. So these Nazi war plants are going to be inefficient, and they're also going to be targets of chronic sabotage. So the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union are going to have more factories, greater productive power, and more people to work in them. And that is going to make the initial Axis advantages hard to keep up. Because remember, the Axis is going into the war with more professional militaries and with better equipment. The Allies can produce more equipment. And as the war goes on, they have more capabilities to start improving their equipment. So the qualitative advantage in equipment is gone by the time you get to the middle of the 40s, by the time you get to 42, 43. For example, by the time you get to the end of the war, the best tank in the world was not German. It was the Soviet T-35 tank. Right? American aircraft were far superior to anything the Japanese could put up by the end of the war. Right? And the quality of the soldiers also, okay, was something that shifted as the war went on. When the war started, Japan and Germany had far more professional militaries. But those professionals died off over the next 5 years. Right? As they died, they would be replaced with people who had less and less training. In the meantime, as the Soviets, the Americans, and the British got their war machines going, they were able to draft more people. Their people got more experience. They got better officers with more experience until finally the qualitative advantage went to them, especially the United States, who have far more time to train people than what the Germans or the Japanese are going to have. Right? So as the war goes on, the Americans, the British, the Soviets get better equipment. They get better people. They have more resources to play with as far as men, as far as manufactured stuff, even things like food. And they're going to have better leadership that will decide how to use it. This is something that probably you would find surprising because the big myth in the world today is that Hitler was a genius. He was evil, but he was very effective at being evil. Right? That he was a military genius and that he was an economic genius. Right? And that the democracies, the communists, would be running inefficient systems compared to him. That is not true. Okay? It's actually the other way around. The Allies actually had extremely good leadership during the Second World War. It was the Axis powers leaders who sucked. Both Germany and Japan were essentially led by idiots, guys who couldn't make up their minds and who had a very diluted view of the world, one not based off of any kind of rational thinking. And this was especially true of Hitler. That is, Hitler was no genius. He was somebody who, as a leader, was really ineffective. The myth about him is due to circumstances. That is, that during the 30s, Nazi Germany recovered from the Depression. So a lot of people say this is because of Hitler's genius. And before the Second World War, the Nazis had a number of early victories. That is, they outmaneuvered their enemies a lot of times. For example, the treaty that ended World War I said that the German army would be limited. This was in the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler denounced the treaty and didn't follow its rules. He got away with it. The treaty said that a part of Germany called the Rhineland couldn't have military forces. He sent the army into it. He got away with it. Hitler went to Austria and annexed it. He got away with it. In 1938, Hitler went into Czechoslovakia and took over most of it. He got away with it. Right? The German armies had early successes in France where they knocked the French out of the war in 6 weeks. In the Soviet Union, their initial attack of the Soviet Union encountered a lot of early successes. So from these, people believe that Hitler must have been a diplomatic and military genius. However, this isn't true, and I want to go into how it wasn't true. And let's start with the economic part. I showed you this chart before when we were looking at the United States in the Great Depression. This was the relative performance of the economies of the world during the Great Depression, right? And let's start by comparing the United States and Germany. This is Germany before the war. It was hit very hard by the Depression. It hits bottom around 1932-33, actually 1932. And then its economy is up to its pre-war levels again by 1936, and it keeps on growing. This looks like a great success for Hitler, except for a few things. Start off with, the German economy hit bottom and started to grow in 1932. Hitler doesn't come to power until 1933. And when Hitler came to power, it didn't grow any faster than it did before. It grows at the same rate. This is because the previous German government, the one before Hitler, actually in 1932 started an employment program. They decided finally that they were going to spend money to try to put people back to work. That program started to show benefits even as early as 1932, and Hitler just kept the program going when he took power. There was nothing brilliant for him about it. Hitler gave a lot of propaganda about how he was going to create jobs through building the highways, the Autobahn in Germany, by building cars, by creating something called the People's Car, which was Volkswagen in Germany. However, although he created a lot of propaganda posters about it, he really didn't do either one of them. The Autobahn was not really developed all that much by Hitler, and they didn't really build many cars. What kept this economy going during the 30s was military spending. Hitler was somebody who wanted to go to war, so he was building up a military to go to war. By the time you get into 1938, about 22% of the entire German economy was military spending. By World War II, it was 45%. Neither one of those is a sustainable figure. That is, if World War II never started, then Germany under Hitler was looking for the same end that the Soviet Union did in the 1990s. The Soviets throughout the Cold War spent 25% of their gross national product on the military. in order to try to keep up with the Americans. Ultimately, that meant their entire civilian economy collapsed. So Hitler was setting up Germany for the same thing. If they didn't lose World War II, their economy was going to flame out spectacularly, right? And then you look at Germany under Hitler and compare it to the United States, this black line over here. When we looked at the United States during the Depression, I was covering over there what the weakness of Franklin Roosevelt was. Remember, I was emphasizing economics. That is, the U.S. economy was Roosevelt's economic policies were mutually contradictory. And that kept economic growth from growing as much. It didn't prolong the Depression, but it slowed down the recovery from it. And the United States, on a per capita level, that's what this chart is showing. It takes the gross national product and divides it by the population, that's per capita income, and adjusts it for the different currencies. That's what PPP means, purchasing power parity. When you look at that, although the American one was part of an economic system that we can say was not ideal, it's growing at the same rate as Germany's was. That is, these two lines are parallel. Right? So if you can't really say that Franklin Roosevelt was a failure and still say that Adolf Hitler was a genius. Right? So if Roosevelt's policies are leading to an uneven recovery, so were Hitler's. Right? And really, you can see the economic growth in both driven by the same thing, the recovery from the business cycle. Finally, if you look at compare the two of them again, the per capita gross national product in Germany recovers its pre-war levels by 1935, whereas in America it takes till 1940. How do you get that when you've got the economic growth rate about the same? You get that because the worst of the Depression was worse in the United States. America fell farther, so it had it farther back to go. And really, the same thing ends the Depression in both America and in Germany, and that was World War II. It's over first in Germany because the Germans started the war. That is, they start their wartime level military spending in 1935. The United States won't start it until 1940. So Hitler was no economic genius. The performance of the German economy was really no better than the American economy. Okay, the differences were more because the American economy suffered more at the worst of the Depression, and because the Americans didn't start the war, the Germans did. So their military spending started later. So Hitler's economic policies weren't brilliant at all. They weren't even particularly effective. And his military diplomatic policies weren't either. Right? Why he had his early successes is, in spite of the fact that really he was an idiot, is something that was pretty understandable. If you've ever played poker, right? You ever played Texas Hold'em poker? I play it every now and then. If you ever played that game, you know there are two ways to win a poker game. Okay? By playing the cards or playing the player. If you play the cards, what you're doing is you learn the odds of particular hands. And you will play those odds accordingly. If you're somebody who takes the odds very seriously, if you're smart, you're good with numbers, and you only play cards that have a good chance of winning and avoid cards that don't, then you're what's called a tight player. If you're, however, somebody who doesn't know anything about the odds and you play any two pair of cards out there, then you're what's called a loose player. Right? The other way to win is to play the player, to know the psychology of your opponents. If you are somebody who likes to initiate the action, who likes to keep your opponents intimidated, then you're an aggressive player. If you're somebody who lets somebody else initiate the action, then you're a passive player. Right? That is, for those of you who play cards, whenever you play a game, some people will never bet. That is, they will never make the first bet. If you bet, they will never raise. All they'll do is match whenever somebody else bets. Those people are passive. You see other people, though, who always like to make the first bet. Right? If it's their turn, nobody's bet yet, they will bet. If somebody else bet, oftentimes they'll raise. Those guys are aggressive. Now, with that in mind, let's look at world leaders in dealing with military and diplomatic events. The logic works exactly the same as a poker game. And the typical world leader, the typical professional is right over here. Just like if you play cards regularly, this is where you'll wind up. That is, if you are a typical world leader, you are somebody smart. You're somebody well educated, you're experienced. But you're afraid of losing. That is, you know the consequences of defeat are terrible. So you're somebody who doesn't want to take chances. So the typical leader will be somebody tight. They will know the odds, and they will only take play games. They will only try to do stuff if they think the odds are in their favor, and they will be very passive. That is, they will not want to initiate action. Right? So if you're the leader of Britain, France, the United States, this is who you are, and this is what you're expecting. The geniuses will be down here. This is true in poker as well. The best players know the odds but are aggressive anyway. Right? That is, they know where the value of any two cards in their hand, but sometimes they'll play bad cards just to keep somebody else off balance. They will make bets because they sense weakness in their opponents, even if they don't think the odds favor it on that particular set of cards. But they know what they're doing. Right? If you're somebody like that, you're in a government, you're Alexander the Great. That is, you just go out and kick ass and take names. And that is where the myth says Hitler is. In reality, though, Hitler was right over here. That is, Hitler was somebody who took crazy chances, chances that had no basis in reality, that had nothing to do with the actual odds of success, and chances that he bet very hard on anyway. If you ever play cards, you probably played against somebody like that. Right? And if you have, they probably won early. That is, a lot of times if you see this player, for a couple of hours, they do really well. And the reason why is because the other players really don't expect it. Because the other players are going to be over here. Right? They're a typical card player, somebody who is passive and somebody who is cautious, somebody who's tight. So when they see a big bet, they are going to assume that the other person has something. Okay? So in the early days, when the leaders of the world were encountering Hitler would make his big bets, and the other side would fold because they don't know what to make of him. Occasionally, somebody will call this guy, and this player can get lucky. If that player gets lucky, then you lose anyway. So, if you've ever played against this card player, that card player in an hour, 2 hours, maybe they do really well. Maybe they've knocked a couple of other people out of the game. But invariably, if the game goes on longer, this player is going to go home buck ass naked broke. Why? Because these guys are going to catch up to him. They're going to start to figure out that this player is full of crap. And they are going to start to set ambushes for him. That is, they're going to get good hands and they're going to lay in wait for this guy to make a move into them. So this player will start to get a couple of losses. This player will then respond by making bigger, crazier bets to try to regain the initiative. Then this player will lose more spectacularly until finally this player has lost everything. And the reason why I gave you that long, elaborate story, because that is the story of Hitler. Hitler made crazy bets during the 1930s when nobody was expecting them, they worked. And as people got used to his game, they worked less and less and less. Until finally, Hitler was totally useless. So Hitler was never a particularly good leader to start with. And as the war went on, he became less and less effective. Because not only were people used to his act by now, Hitler himself started to lose his cognitive function as you get through the Second World War. Partially, this was medical. Right? That is, I'll show you a picture again of Hitler. I showed you this picture earlier. If you're somebody with a medical background, you might be able to detect a medical problem by looking at this picture of Hitler. Right? Look at this arm. This is his left arm. Hitler is making all of his gestures here with his right, but he's keeping his left arm stiff beside him. That is something that is commonly done by people who have Parkinson's syndrome. Right? Parkinson's syndrome is a neurological disorder, and the first symptom of it is a tremor in your offhand. Oftentimes, people who have that syndrome will grab something in their offhand and flex out that arm so that it won't shake, or at least the tremor will be next noticeable. By the time Hitler got into the 1940s, though, this Parkinson's was getting worse and worse. And Parkinson's is a degenerative neurological disorder, meaning that as the war was going on, Hitler's cognitive functions were getting more and more impaired. That basically his brains were turning into guacamole. If you've seen any film of Hitler in 1945, there are only a few of those films out there. He's shaken like a leaf. That is, the tremors are everywhere. And to the limited extent that he could think rationally before World War II, he can't do it anymore. Right? So Hitler's mind is steadily degenerating as the war goes on because of this medical condition, because Parkinson's. It's also degenerating because of a psychological condition. Hitler was a notorious hypochondriac. He was convinced that he got syphilis from a Jewish prostitute. Right? A lot of racists are like that. They get sexual hang-ups on the people that they are fixated on. Right? As you went to the American South 100 years ago, you had a lot of white racists who had black girlfriends because they thought black women were hotter since they were inferiors. The Nazis thought the same thing about Jewish women. A surprising number of Nazis kept Jewish mistresses. They had a sexual fixation on them. And this idea that by having sex with a racial inferior, you get a venereal disease as punishment is something also that's pretty common with racists. So Hitler was this hypochondriac who was convinced he had syphilis. So he got himself a Jackson doctor to treat the imaginary syphilis. How that Michael Jackson doctor treated him was he gave him two things. One was he gave him the extract of the cola nut, which was caffeine. The second thing he gave him were amphetamine pills. Right? So throughout the Second World War, Hitler was tweaking. It wasn't crystal methamphetamine. That isn't invented until the 1940s. What he were taking were what the truckers call pep pills. This was really a standard issue for the German army throughout the Second World War. German army gave them to soldiers to fight fatigue. And this is one of the reasons why the German army was so sadistic during the war. You keep popping amphetamines long enough, the Holocaust doesn't sound like a bad idea anymore. Right? So as the 1940s go on, Hitler's mind is being hollowed out. Between the Parkinson's and the amphetamines, his brains are turning into guacamole. Considering he was an idiot to start with, that is a frightening picture by 1945. So Germany has a leader that is growing increasingly erratic and ineffective as the war goes on. He's still better than the Japanese government. The Japanese government was totally ineffective. It was ruled by a clique of Army and Navy officers who were totally divorced from reality, especially the Army officers. They had no formal education outside of Army training, and they had no travel throughout the rest of the world. So all they did was put forward a lot of racial stereotypes, and that became the plan. Right? And there was really nobody even in charge. Most fascist nations had a Fuhrer. The Japanese had a collective leadership. That is, all of their idiots had to come together and make a common decision. So the Japanese leadership was something that was very ineffective during the war. They made terrible decisions. On the other side, though, the Allies were led by people who were highly effective. Here is Winston Churchill. He was the Prime Minister of Great Britain during the Second World War. British historians did a survey of themselves where they tried to figure out who the best leader of their nation was in the 1,000-year history of England. Guess who they picked? Right? They picked Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill once said that Franklin Roosevelt over here, the President of the United States, was so charismatic that being in a room with him was like being in a room with the champagne when they popped the cork. When you're so bubbly that other politicians notice, you got some serious charisma. And we went over Roosevelt, the political leader, before. He was a highly effective political leader. He was very good at keeping people together. So arguably, the United States and Great Britain had the best leaders in their history, leading them during the Second World War. And then there was Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin over here was the leader of the Soviet Union. He was one of the most evil men who ever existed. Right? He was notoriously paranoid and ruthless. He took power in the Soviet Union in 1927. Right? When he took power, he pushed aside the rest of the collective that would have led the Soviet Union, killed them all, and took dictatorial power. He would keep it until his death in 1952. He was a communist to the bone, which meant, among other things, that he was paranoid as all hell. He was convinced that the property-owning nations of the world would try to undermine the Soviet Union by conspiring with traitors within the Soviet Union. So he created a secret police force to go into the Soviet Union and find all the traitors. He gave every member of the secret police of how many traitors they were supposed to find. And if you didn't find that many traitors, you obviously were one of the traitors. Basically, he took the business model of the Soviet Union from the Salem witch trials. This created in the 30s a series of purges, which rounded up millions of people and sent them into concentration camps for nothing. It wound up leading to about 10 million deaths. Right? Arguably, nobody in the history of the world has killed as many communists as Joseph Stalin did. By 1938, Stalin took that purge and put it into the army. That is, he said the army was full of traitors. We arrested all of their leaders and had them shot. Others were just sent to concentration camps. So by 1941, the Soviet army is basically a shell. It has a bunch of soldiers, but it has nobody experienced at the top. That is, all their experienced officers were purged and they're trying to train new ones. Stalin in 1939 cut a deal with Germany called the Non-Aggression Pact, where he showed that he would not attack Germany if Germany wouldn't attack him. He was hoping that this would mean that Germany would attack England and France instead, because he, remember, was a communist. He thought that the capitalist nations, the property-owning nations, would inevitably fight against each other. He stuck to that. And if you were in the Soviet Union, you did not tell Stalin what he didn't want to hear, because then you were obviously one of the traitors who was out to destroy the Soviet Union. Right? Between 1939 and 1941, Soviet spies started to learn that the Germans were out to double-cross them and that the Germans were planning an invasion. Stalin didn't want to hear it. If you tried to tell him that the Germans were invading, he would have you shot. He even went to the extent that he told his army to move away from the border, right, so that they would not be a provocation to the Germans. Basically, he let the Germans have a running start when they came into the Soviet Union. So when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviets were totally unprepared. Soviet armies were destroyed. And Stalin froze. Eventually, some Soviet officers came into his office. When they did, he grabbed his desk and just stood up rigid. He thought those officers were going to shoot him because that's what he would have done. However, instead, they gave him a pep talk. They told him to man up. And after that, Stalin put it together. That is, although he was evil, he was somebody who was actually a pretty effective leader. That is, he was a very good organizer. And communist systems, for all their flaws, are systems that are pretty good at executing big projects. For example, if you're watching the coronavirus in China, the Chinese communists decided they wanted a hospital in Wuhan, so they built a hospital. They had the thing up in about a week. They aren't very good at creating quality, and oftentimes they aren't very good at, and they're especially not very good at creating systems. So they will do something like create an airplane plant, but not come up with any ball bearings to put in the airplane because they forgot to make the factories for them. But they can do big projects. So if you look at the stereotype most people have of Hitler, that is, he was evil, but he was pretty effective during a war. It doesn't really apply very well to Hitler, but it does apply pretty well to Stalin. That is, Stalin was able to turn the Soviet war effort around, get war production back up again after their initial defeats. They were able to rebuild the Soviet army. And then by the time you get to 1943-44, the Soviets are pushing the Germans back. And by 1945, the Soviet army is in Berlin. So you have an Allied side that has better equipment, more people, and has leaders who know how to take advantage of that. Right? And as the qualitative advantages of the Axis armies disappear as the war goes on, this war is going to become more and more hopeless for them. But those aren't the only edges that the Allies had. One big advantage the Allies had was that the German attempt to knock out the Soviet Union failed. So I want to give you a little bit about it. In 1939, as I said before, the German government and the Soviet government signed a peace treaty. The peace treaty said that neither side would attack the other. In June of 1941, Hitler decided to break the treaty. He actually decided it earlier in 1941. This is oftentimes seen as a bad decision by Hitler. Although Hitler was an idiot generally, this is a decision that is actually defensible. Right? It's defensible if you've ever read The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. That was the starting point, really, of strategy in the Western world, that book, The Prince. And one of the things that Machiavelli said in The Prince was that if you think war is inevitable, delaying the war is not peace. Delaying the war just means you lose. Hitler, the fascist, thought that a war with communism was inevitable. So he figured, I'm going to strike while the iron is hot. If I attack now in 1941, I'm hitting them when they're not expecting it. I'm hitting them when the Soviet army is disorganized, when they don't have officers to command their men, and before they've gotten a chance to build up their military. If I wait 4 or 5 years, maybe that chance won't be there. And in the meantime, once the Soviets build themselves up, they'll take the first shot. I, the only real error in that logic is the idea that a war with the Soviet Union was inevitable. Because remember when we covered communism, communist thinking is to avoid war because they figure Germany, as long as it's fighting England, France, and America, that's good for them. And that they figure communism is going to make the Soviet Union a paradise. So every year they delay the war, the stronger they are, the better they'll be able to handle Germany. Right? Until the inevitable revolution where the fascists fall apart. So if Hitler misses that reality of communism, which is logical to miss, then the rest of his thinking isn't that crazy. The idea that he could launch a knockout blow and take out the Soviets before they're ready for it. However, the plan went wrong. What led the plan to go wrong first, the first thing that went wrong, was the nation of Italy. Italy decided that since Germany was out conquering stuff, they wanted to conquer stuff too. So they invaded the nation of Greece. The Italian army, though, was so bad they lost. So Germany was forced to send troops into Greece in order to salvage the situation. They didn't want the embarrassment of seeing an Italian defeat, which meant that the invasion of the Soviet Union was delayed. Okay? That is, German soldiers were planning on starting their invasion of the Soviet Union in the spring of 1941, sometime in March or April. But since they had to go to Greece, they had to delay the invasion until June. And by the way, going into Greece meant that they also had to invade Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia became a big headache for the German army for the remainder of the war. And as they had a chronic guerrilla war over there that tied down over 1 million German soldiers. So anyway, the Soviets didn't launch their invasion until June of 1941. The initial invasion was very successful. That is, Soviet German soldiers went into the Soviet Unions and chopped up Soviet armies. By the time you get into September of 1941, they have pushed they have pushed deep into the Soviet Union, right? And then they ran into trouble. The trouble was the weather. It wasn't winter. Okay? The weather they ran into was the fall. The reason why the fall was the problem is because the fall in Eastern Europe is the rainy season. So in September, the rain started pouring, and the roads in the Soviet Union were pretty primitive. So the roads basically turned into fields of mud. And the Germans had to bring all of their supplies up through horse-drawn wagons. Right? So the German army had to wait in forward position till their supplies got there. So they had to stop. They actually got the attack starting it again when the winter came because it froze the mud. However, by then, Stalin was able to get 500,000 troops and bring them to Moscow. Right? And that was enough to stop the German attack. The Germans got close enough to Moscow that they could actually see the Kremlin from their former positions, but they couldn't actually take Moscow. Right? So the invasion in 1941 petered out. And the Germans never really got close to finishing off the Soviets after that. And when they didn't finish off the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union didn't fall apart, that missed one of their big chances of winning the war because the odds were never good for them anyway. But the odds in winning a war where there was no Soviet Union were a lot higher than they were of winning a war with a Soviet Union. Right? And actually, by the fall of 1941, there's a lot of smart money that thought the Soviet Union was going to fall apart. In America, the Army and Navy chiefs of staff all were making plans that the Soviet Union was going to end. They thought that the Soviet Union wouldn't survive 1941. Actually, the only big world leader who thought the Soviets would survive was Franklin Roosevelt. That is, he thought the Soviets would be able to regroup. When political scientists looked at World War II afterwards, nowadays they can model the war off of computers. So they put the situation of 1941 into the computers. And when they run the simulations, half of the times the Soviet government collapses as a result of their defeats in 1941. Half of the time it survives. So basically, the survival of the Soviet Union basically boiled down to a coin flip. And because it survived, Germany was going to be in an impossible position afterwards. So Germany took a big gamble to try to knock the Soviet Union out. It didn't work. So you now have a war as you get into the 1940s where the Allies have more men. They have more productive capacity. Right? They have better leadership. They're increasingly building up better and better militaries, right, that are going to be hammering away at the Axis. And they still have additional advantages we haven't gotten to yet. One of the big advantages of the Allied side was that they had very superior information gathering capabilities. Right? That is, they had better intelligence services. The Soviets specialized in human intelligence. That is, they had spies throughout Japan and Germany. Their spy network was good enough to give them advance warning of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin just couldn't take advantage of that information for reasons we went to earlier. Right? The British and the Americans specialized more in what is called signal intelligence. That is, they would overhear enemy communications and break codes. The Americans, for example, broke the Japanese diplomatic code even before World War II started. Right? So they intercepted a communication from Tokyo to the embassy in Washington on December 6th, telling them that uh, the attack on Pearl Harbor was going to be the next day and to burn all the documents in the embassy. Right? So once the Americans got this message, they decrypted the code. But the initial message was in Japanese. And December the 6th was a Saturday. Since it was the weekend, they didn't have any interpreters in the office. So they sent it to the interpreter, and the interpreter interpreted it as soon as he got to the office, the first thing Monday morning, December the 8th, right? Which sucked for them. But their code breaking made a big difference in the war with Japan. For example, the big American naval victory in the war was the Battle of Midway. And one of the reasons why the Americans were able to win at Midway was because they broke the Japanese naval code by 1942. So they knew that the Japanese were going to attack Midway, and they were able to turn it into an ambush. The British also had very good signal intelligence. And one of the reasons why is the man you're looking at in this picture. His name is Alan Turing. Okay? Turing is somebody you might be familiar with if you're knowledgeable about computer science. He is the guy who created the Turing test, which is a central idea in artificial intelligence. That is, you have a real artificial intelligence. If you talk to a computer and a human observer can't tell that they're talking to a computer, that's the Turing test. He also is famous in computer science for designing the Turing machine, which was an early algorithm for a computer. But during World War II, he worked for British military intelligence, MI6, and he broke codes for them. He was working out of their Benchley Park facility. And Benchley Park was a very sophisticated operation. Among the things they did was Turing, in order to break German codes, created the world's first digital computer in 1943. It was called Colossus. It analyzed German communications and looked for patterns. And the British at Benchley Park broke a lot of German codes. Among the codes they broke was the big German army military code, Enigma. Right? Enigma was an interesting system. It was based off of a hybrid electrical electronic device, right, that combined with encryption. And let's see how it worked. If you were the operator of this machine, when the day started, you were supposed to turn these wheels, 3 wheels over here, to random symbols. Right? When you did, you would read the code for the day, and you would set out a specified coded message to other operators. So those other operators would know from the coded message, they would know what the message you were going to send was. They'd be able to figure out what wheels your machine was set at. So they could set their wheels to match it, right? And then you would type in coded messages on this keyboard over here. Right? The wheels would encrypt the code, it would encrypt your message electronically. Right? And you would type in a code that started with a cipher in the first place. Right? So if you had a message, something like hello, you would look up in the code book what hello was supposed to be that day. You would then type that into your keyboard. That message would then be electronically scrambled based off of how you set your wheels. Right? You would then send it, the operator on the other end would set the wheels on his machine to make yours, turn it back into the original code. He would look at his code book and decode it. The Germans thought this system was so elaborate that nobody would ever be able to break it. The British broke it. How the British were able to break it was actually not really using all of their fancy technology like the computers. They broke it through kind of human intelligence. They had radio operators who would listen in on German communications. They found that the same German Enigma operators were working the same machines every day. And they found that they could get sloppy when they randomized the wheels. For example, a lot of them would put in their girlfriends' names if they had to put like roll six wheels. A surprising number of them, when they had to six wheels, put in HITLER. When they had four wheels, you'd be surprised how many times they put in FUCK or SHIT. So by those failures, the Germans allowed the British to get around one level of encryption, as the randomization of the electronics were supposed to give, especially when they captured machines and were able to build their own. So after that, then they can turn their computers on the code. And they broke it. And throughout the war, the British had very good ideas over what the Germans were going to do. And this had all kinds of military applications. For example, the Germans were fighting in North Africa. They had to supply their army through convoys that would be leaving on boats from Italy to get to North Africa. The British broke the German army's code. So they were able to get the schedules of those boats, so they always sent planes to intercept them, sank most of them. The German military commander in North Africa, Rommel, was furious. He thought that Italians couldn't keep their mouths shut, and they were letting the entire world know what those schedules were. He didn't realize that the problem was in his own command, in his own codes. And really, the Germans throughout the war never really realized that Enigma was broken. When they interrogated German prisoners after the war was over, the German officers were shocked that Enigma was broken. They didn't think it was possible. So the Allies were able to break enemy codes. They're able to have spies to figure out what the enemy was going to do. And if you have that kind of intelligence capability, that's an advantage even without all the other stuff. And when you add it into all the material advantage the Allies could have, you're getting a war that's becoming more and more inevitable. But the Allies had other advantages other than that. One edge that they're going to have is going to be the submarine. Usually, when you think of submarines, you think of Germany, Germany using the U boats. And the Germans used the U boats during the Second World War as well. They used them very effectively. And by 1943, it looked like losses of shipping the U boats were so severe, it could threaten the ability of Britain and the Soviet Union to stay in the war. However, in 1943, the Americans and the British came up with an answer for the U boat. The Americans sent one squadron of B-24 bombers. Instead of sending them to bomb Germany, they sent them in the other direction over the Atlantic to look for U-boats. They found enough of them that German U-boats started to suffer heavy losses. Add to that, as the war went on, American and British ships were getting better technology, especially sonar, their ability to find enemy submarines. So they were able to limit the damage that they got from German and Japanese submarines, although both Germany and Japan used them effectively. However, American submarines, such as the one you're looking at here, were much more effective when they were fighting against Japan. Japan is a nation that is essentially a series of islands. They have to bring in supplies by boat from everywhere, and they're sending soldiers to fronts all over the Pacific. They never really developed a very good anti-submarine capability. They used submarines pretty well, but they didn't really know how to fight them. The reason why was they were fighting a war against the Americans based off of racial stereotypes. Life on a submarine is hard duty. Submarines are very cramped. They're very crowded. You spent 6 months at sea. You spent a lot of time under claustrophobic conditions underwater. So the Japanese figured that since this duty was so hard, Americans wouldn't be able to do it because Americans are essentially a bunch of sissies. They're soft. They like their creature comforts, their luxuries, their money. And if you ask them to do anything hard, they're just going to fail. They're going to refuse to do it. That's a common stereotype of Americans in Asia. That is, living in America. You hear stereotypes off of other people. It's kind of funny to learn that the other people in the world have stereotypes of us as well. And the idea that Americans are soft, are pushovers, won't work when it gets hard is a pretty common one. And the Japanese based a lot of their war plans off of it. So, since they said life on a submarine was hard, they figured Americans wouldn't do it. So they figured we as Japan don't need to come up with a way to look for submarines. The Americans used submarines and they used them very well. And since with the Japanese had no defenses, American submarines just went nuts finding and sinking Japanese shipping. Right? By the time we get to 1945, there are even American submarines in the Sea of Japan between Korea, China, and Japan, and they're sinking anything that is going across trying to cross the sea. So you have submarines being a very effective tool for the Allies, right? Especially in the Japanese War. But another big advantage that the Allies have is oil. You can see the Second World War as, to an extent, an oil war. That is, oil was the major reason, one of the major reasons why they were fighting, and it was a major thing that was driving strategy. Right? For example, the Japanese started their war against the United States because they were going here. These are the islands that today make up the nation of Indonesia. A number of these islands, especially Borneo, had large oil deposits. Right? Japan and the United States had a dispute over China. The Japanese had invaded it. The Americans told them to leave. By 1940, the Americans, in order to get the Japanese to stop their war in China, had started an oil embargo. This is kind of strange to think of today, but in 1941 and for the years before that, America was actually the largest exporter of oil in the world. America didn't become a net importer of oil until 1946, right? So Japanese industry was almost entirely dependent on American oil. And without American oil, their ships couldn't sail, their planes couldn't fly, they couldn't run their factories. So the Japanese in 1941 decided that if they were going to keep their war in China, they would need a new source of oil. They figured that these islands over here would do it. But they figured that taking these islands would mean a war with the United States. So they were going to get the first shot. They attacked Pearl Harbor, and then they attacked the Dutch East Indies and took over the oil fields. So basically, the entire Japanese war strategy was based off of, to a large extent, off of getting oil so they could continue the war. The same thing was true of the Germans. That is, the major gamble that Hitler took when he ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union was the cutoff of their oil supply. The Germans depended almost entirely on imported Soviet oil to run their army. If they invaded the Soviet Union, obviously the Soviets wouldn't sell them any more oil. So Hitler ordered the main German attack to go south towards the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus Mountains. That's one of the reasons why they couldn't take Moscow. Hitler ordered a lot of the main attack, rather than going to Moscow, to go south towards the oil fields. In 1942, the Germans launched a major offensive to try to take those oil fields. In order to take the oil fields, which are down here, the German army first wanted to take the city here. It's called Stalingrad. Stalingrad is a major rail center that leads down in the south. So if you control Stalingrad, you could keep the Russian armies down here from being reinforced, and you can use the rail supplies in order to send your armies down south into these mountains to take the oil fields. That's why the Germans were at Stalingrad. And if you're familiar with World War II, Stalingrad was a major defeat for the Germans. They had an entire army chewed to pieces at Stalingrad, and was the beginning of the end of the German army. The Soviets would defeat another German attack at a place called, I'm totally blanking on this now. It's the greatest tank battle in the history of the world, and I can't remember it. Kursk, at a place called Kursk in 1943. And then they would start their great offensive, which would end when the Soviet army occupied Berlin in May of 1945. And the lack of ability of Germany and Japan to get oil crippled their entire war efforts. That is, since they couldn't get enough supplies of oil, they couldn't train pilots. So as the war went on, their pilots became increasingly inferior in quality to what their enemies were putting up. They didn't have enough fuel in order to let their ships maneuver. So the Japanese Navy spent more and more of their time in port. The Soviet army has so little fuel that their tanks couldn't maneuver, which limited their ability to fight. Right? And ultimately, their inability to come up with an alternative source of oil was one of the things that led to one of the major forces why the Germans and Japanese lost. On the other side, the biggest producer of oil in the world in 1941 was America. The second biggest producer of oil in the world was the Soviet Union. Britain didn't have any internal oil making capabilities, but their empire did. Britain controlled Iraq, which was a major source of oil at the time. And the British had a great deal of influence in Iran. It was part of their indirect empire. So from Iran, they got more oil. Right? So the oil difference was a major deciding factor in the war as well. And it was one that favored the Allies dramatically. By the way, one other thing about this, if you're interested in this type of technology, the Germans in the 1930s tried to develop a way to make artificial petroleum. It's a process called hydrogenation. In hydrogenation, you can take one hydrocarbon and make it into another one. So they were taking coal and trying to turn it into petroleum. The technology to do that's been around for 70 years. Just the cost of doing it is really high, so it's uneconomical. Even when oil was $100 a gallon, it wasn't worth the cost of drilling coal and turning it into petroleum when you compared it to what you could do just by getting oil at $100 a gallon. When you have oil like today's at about $20, I mean, $100 a barrel. Once you get oil today that's $20 a barrel, you really don't use hydrogenation. But the technology is there. Hydrogenation was even used to turn things like biological fats into diesel fuel. Willie Nelson did that. He called it bio-Willie. He took restaurant grease and turned it into diesel fuel. Right? You can do that through hydrogenation. It's just not economical. The Germans tried to use that as a means in order to overcome their oil deficit. They couldn't produce enough fuel in order to make it worthwhile. The final big advantage I want to go through for the Allies was the moral advantage. That is, the Allies had the moral high ground during the war. This is something that sounds like propaganda, especially since the Allies were doing a lot of things were morally questionable. For example, the Allies fought according to a principle they called total war, which said they were fighting a war against an entire enemy society. So if they were going to win the war, they were going to destroy the entire society, which meant they were going to get civilians too. Right? So throughout the war, England and America launched bomber raids on civilian targets, on cities, to try to destroy factories that produce war materials in the cities. In addition to that, they targeted civilians who would work in those factories. They called this by the euphemism dehousing the workers. The British would bomb cities by launching big air raids at night where they didn't even bother to aim their bombs. They just dropped a lot of bombs designed to do a lot of targets, destroy a lot of targets randomly. They call this area bombing. The United States believed they were bombing cities more efficiently. That is, they said that they could bomb a city accurately. Their primary technology to do this was something called the Norton bomb sight. They said with a Norton bomb sight, you could put a bomb into a pickle barrel from 35,000 feet. In reality, accuracy for an American bomber turned out to be if they were aiming at a target, they could put a bomb somewhere between in a half a mile radius of that target. And so if you draw a circle a mile in diameter, a bomb will last somewhere in that circle. Right? So they destroyed a lot of civilian targets. The worst of these in Europe was the British and American raid of a German city called Dresden. Right? In the bombing raid of Dresden, they started fires throughout the city. The city was made largely of wood. And those fires wound up killing about 29,000 civilians. The Germans made a huge propaganda campaign off of this in 1945. They said that Dresden was a town full of refugees, it had no military significance, and the British and Americans launched a sadistic attack on it. Actuality, that wasn't exactly true. The city was a rail depot. And the Russians asked the Americans and the British to bomb that city so that the Germans couldn't use it to stage resistance against the Soviet offensive that was coming in from the east. But they did kill 30,000 civilians, 29,000 civilians there, which is a lot of people. The Americans in Japan launched even bigger raids. For example, by the time you got to 1945, starting in March, the Americans decided that they were, rather than trying to bomb specific targets in Japan, they were just going to totally destroy Japanese cities. Japanese cities were largely made out of wood and paper. So the Americans dropped bombs out of them that had napalm in them. Napalm is jelly gasoline. Once it hits something, it just sticks to it and sets fires. In the bombing raid on Tokyo in March of 1945, for example, the Americans killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 130,000 civilians. By the end of the war, the Americans have developed the atomic bomb that can destroy an entire city with one bomb. In Hiroshima, for example, they killed 70,000 civilians. So you can look at this and say the Americans or the British would be totally hypocritical to claim they had a moral advantage, let alone the Soviets. That would be true unless you were fighting the Germans or the Japanese. Remember, the Germans were the people who launched the Holocaust. They were launching mass campaigns designed to specifically exterminate civilian targets. The Japanese in China were not really any better. The Japanese were sadistic in their targeting of Chinese civilians. For example, the man you're looking at in this picture is a Japanese doctor. He was part of a Japanese army unit that was a secret army unit that operated in China. Their goal was to come up with weaponizable biological weapons. So what this doctor is doing is he just injected this Chinese prisoner, I believe, with anthrax. And once he ejected him, he is going to dissect him to see what the anthrax is doing. He's dissecting him while he's still alive. And he's doing the dissection without any anesthetic. Right? The Japanese launched campaigns like that throughout World War II against the Chinese. For example, in 1938, Japan attacked the Chinese capital at Nanking. Once they took Nanking, the Japanese army for the next 6 weeks just went medieval on the town. They started massacring civilians, raping women. They were so brutal that the German ambassador in Nanking was appalled. He tried to get civilians out. He thought if Hitler knew what was going up, he would be shocked. That was a guy who was unclear of the concept. Right? There was a story, this was really true, where two Japanese officers decided to test their samurai swords. They tested it off of Chinese civilians. That is, they would take out their samurai sword and behead a civilian. If they could behead a civilian in one stroke, their sword was sharp enough. If it took them more than one to hack their way through, they would need to sharpen their sword. That was something that was routinely done by the Japanese army in China. Two Japanese officers also had a contest. The contest was how many Chinese civilians could they kill. One officer beat the other 139 to 138. How do we know this? Because it was covered in the Japanese newspapers, in the sports page. Right? And if you look at the statistics from the war, you can see this. That is, if you look at the total amount of deaths in the war, the majority of deaths were actually Allied civilians, particularly in the Soviet Union, China, and Poland. Right? These were places where Axis forces just deliberately targeted civilians and tried to kill them because they were racial inferiors. In Indonesia, the Japanese essentially started a famine. They took food out of Indonesia and sent it back to Japan. This wound up killing millions of people. The Germans deliberately did that throughout Europe. That is, they said, we're going to make sure that German civilians don't go hungry. How we're going to do that is take away food from everybody else. When the Germans went into the Soviet Union, uh, the German army didn't bring in any plans to feed Soviet prisoners. They just put them into camps and let them starve to death. Right? If the camps were in Poland, if any local Polish civilians tried to help the Soviet prisoners, they would kill them too. And you add the Holocaust to that, and you've got basically a bloodbath going on. Although the Allies were targeting civilians in their bombing campaigns, this wasn't nearly as indiscriminate and brutal as what the Germans and the Japanese were doing. And this was something that was fairly well known. And this made it very difficult for the Axis to build support. Because remember, countries like England, the United States, France are imperialist nations. They have conquered large parts of the world. They therefore have captive populations who are looking for freedom. The Soviet Union was an extremely brutal nation. The communist government was brutal. And there were a lot of citizens in the Soviet Union who were looking for a way to get out from under the communists. If the Axis nations, if Germany and Japan had taken advantage of this, they had a chance to really make their odds better in the war. For example, when they went into the Soviet Union, the German army in the Ukraine was treated as heroes. That is, local civilians came up to them and gave them flowers because they saw them as liberators from the communists. However, their treatment of the Ukrainians was so barbaric that within a year, the Ukrainians were forming guerrilla regiments to try to fight them. Right? Throughout Asia, Asians looked at the Japanese war effort and saw so much brutality that even against imperialist powers, they weren't willing to join up in the fight. Right? So you put that all together, you have an Axis war side that has basically no chance of winning the war. Right? That is, there's in science fiction nowadays, there's a big thing called alternate history. Right? And one of the big things that alternate histories like is they like to imagine a future where the Nazis won World War II. If you've ever played the Castle Wolfenstein games, that is the basis. That's the basis of their setting. Or on Amazon, there's a TV show, The Man in the High Castle. That was actually based off of a book by a guy named Philip K. Dick in 1960, which was one of the first alternate histories. It's based off of the idea that the Germans could have won World War II. In reality, though, this really wasn't true. That is, even if everything broke right, it's still difficult to imagine a future where the Axis powers could have done any better than they actually did. And as we've seen, the Axis powers, to a certain extent, took big gambles and got lucky that they worked. There are a lot more easier ways to imagine a future where Germany and Japan lost spectacularly earlier than you can imagine a future where Germany and Japan wound up coming out of the other end winning the war. Even in the Japanese war with China, sooner or later, the Chinese were going to win that war. That is, the Japanese just had no way to actually finish the war off. It might have taken decades, right? But eventually, Japan was going to get exhausted and wind up leaving. Right? So, if you look at why the Allies won the war, everything was leading in this direction. Right? The only real question you could ask is why did it take them that long? And with that, I shall stop here, and we will deal with another subject at a future time.